It was the summer of my 18th birthday when I met him. He was everything they said he would be: rich, powerful, commanding. My parents had arranged the meeting. A simple dinner at a restaurant, a step into the world they had carefully curated for me. A world I hadn't asked for, but one they expected me to embrace. I had always known there were certain people in this world who lived lives far removed from mine, but I never imagined that one of them would leave such a mark on me. I thought he was a myth, a cautionary tale whispered behind closed doors about the kind of man who could ruin a girl like me. I should have known better than to underestimate him. I should have known that meeting him would be the beginning of something irreversible. The evening had been ordinary at first. My parents had put on their best faces, all smiles and stiff upper lips, as they introduced me to him. A man in his 40s with a jawline sharp enough to cut glass and eyes that never seemed to blink. He looked at me as if I were a puzzle, something to be solved, something of no real consequence but still worth his attention. "My daughter Audrey," my father had said, his voice thick with pride, as if I were a prize to be shown off. "She's just come of age." The man's gaze lingered for a moment, his lips curling into something close to a smile. "I can see that," he said, though I had no idea what that meant. He was introduced only as Mr. Blackwell. I later learned that was an alias, a carefully crafted name to disguise the vast empire he controlled. I learned that the man sitting before me, the one whose eyes bored into mine with a subtle intensity, had more influence in one hand than most people would ever dream of in their entire lives. He wasn't just wealthy. He owned industries, controlled markets, bent governments to his will. And my parents, they had arranged for me to meet him. I had never felt so small in my life. At the time, I couldn't understand why they would want me to be a part of his world. They'd never told me much about him, just that it was a great opportunity. But I was 18. The world seemed both too big and too small at once. I thought I could handle anything. The evening proceeded with the usual pleasantries: wine, light conversation, an exchange of jokes that felt more like rituals than anything real. But the deeper we went into the meal, the more I began to feel that something was wrong. The man was not what I had imagined, not at all like the tycoons I'd read about in the tabloids or seen in movies. He wasn't just an older man with power. He was cold, calculating, the kind of person who made you believe the world could be bent to your will with enough money and influence. And then, just as I thought the evening would end like every other family gathering, he dropped the bombshell. "You're quite beautiful," he said, his voice smooth like silk, as though we were speaking of something far less significant than what came next. "But beauty is a commodity, isn't it? A rare one. And it has its price." My parents, who had been so poised until that point, did nothing to intervene. They merely exchanged a glance, one I didn't understand. "What price?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Though my heart had begun to race, he smiled. The kind of smile that made you feel as if you were being dissected under a microscope. "The price of entry into a world where you can have anything and anyone you desire." I was too naive to understand then, but in that moment, I felt something cold pass through me, a chill that would never leave. That night, everything happened. 2 months later, I found out I was pregnant. I didn't have to ask who the father was. The realization hit me like a freight train. The affair had been brief, a week of shared moments between meetings, between deals. I never thought it would go that far. He'd promised it wouldn't, that it would be a fleeting thing. But it wasn't. I'd been too young, too naive, and perhaps too willing to believe the power of someone like him would make me feel important. I had let myself become a pawn. When I told him, I expected the usual response, an apology, an explanation, perhaps even some kind of responsibility. But instead, he looked at me with a coldness that took my breath away. "I have no time for distractions," he said. "Get rid of it." Those words echoed in my ears, a deafening sound that I could still hear long after he had walked away, leaving me with nothing but a stomach full of uncertainty and fear. I begged. I pleaded. But he wouldn't budge. "My life is not yours to disrupt, Audrey," he told me. "You've made your choice. live with it. My parents' reaction was worse. When I tried to tell them, when I explained everything, how I had fallen for someone who didn't care about me, how I was alone and scared, they simply turned their backs on me. "You've ruined everything," my father said. "We've made too many sacrifices for you to throw it all away on one mistake. Don't come back," my mother added, her voice sharp with a cruelty I had never heard from her before. "You've chosen your path. Now walk it alone." I had nowhere to go. But then, just as I was about to lose all hope, he appeared. Mark, my childhood friend, the one person who had always been there, who had never left me. We had been close for as long as I could remember. A constant, a steady presence in a life that had always been filled with turbulence. He didn't hesitate when I told him what had happened. There were no questions, no judgments. Just a promise that he would help me no matter what it took. "I don't care who the father is, Audrey. I'll raise him with you," Mark said. "You won't be alone in this." And so, together we made a life. But the past has a way of returning, doesn't it? And as much as I tried to move forward, as much as I tried to forget about the man who had so easily discarded me, life had other plans. A call came one evening, not long after we had settled into our new life. It was from Mr. Blackwell's estate. "He's dying, Audrey," the voice on the other end of the phone said, cold as always. "He wants to see his son." It's funny, isn't it? How a man can destroy everything and still demand a piece of it when it suits him. And now, here I am, back at the crossroads. Mark and I have built a life together, one that is imperfect but full of love. But what do I do when the past comes knocking at the door, demanding what it believes it is owed? The man who had promised me nothing, and taken everything, now wants to claim the only thing I have left at my son. I hadn't seen him in years. Not since that night. Not since the cold finality of his words had etched themselves into my memory like a scar that would never fade. And yet, here I was, standing outside the gates of Blackwell Manor, my heart a heavy weight in my chest. The sprawling estate loomed before me, an oppressive reminder of everything I had left behind, everything I had fought to escape. The grand marble pillars, the manicured gardens, the vast windows that gleamed like watchful eyes. It all felt suffocating, a world I had never truly belonged to. And yet, now it seemed to want me back. Mark stood beside me, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder, a silent anchor in the storm that churned within me. He hadn't said much during the drive here. He didn't need to. I could feel the tension in the air, feel the weight of his worry for me, but also his unwavering loyalty. Mark had always been the one to stand by me, no matter the cost. And now he was here as he always had been, ready to face whatever came next. But could I face him? I took a deep breath and stepped forward, the sound of gravel crunching beneath my feet the only thing breaking the silence. The butler who greeted us at the door didn't ask questions. There was no welcome, no warmth, just the perfunctory nod of someone used to serving men like Mr. Blackwell. He led us through the grand hallways, past portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow me with judgment, past walls that gleamed with wealth and power. And then we reached the door to the study. The man who had once been my greatest mistake sat in a chair by the window, his back to us. His frame was thin, almost frail now, as though time had finally caught up with him. He was older, his hair thinner, streaked with gray, but his presence was still formidable. The power that had once oozed from him like a second skin was now merely a faint echo, but the sharpness in his eyes hadn't dulled. If anything, it was sharper, cold. It sliced through me as though I were still that naive girl, still just a pawn in his game. "You came," he said, his voice low, almost a rasp. I didn't respond at first. What could I say? What was there to say? The years had not softened the bitterness between us. I could feel Mark's hand tightening around mine, as if to remind me I wasn't alone. "You're dying," I finally said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Is that why you want to see your son? To make amends before it's too late?" Blackwell turned slowly in his chair, and I saw the faintest glimmer of a smile on his lips. I don't need your forgiveness, Audrey. I never did. His gaze shifted to Mark, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. But I do want to see my son. Before the end. There was something in his voice, a chill that ran deeper than I could understand. I had always assumed he was the kind of man who only saw people as tools, but this felt different. Felt like something darker. A power grab? A desperate attempt at redemption? Or perhaps a twisted sense of legacy? I wasn't sure. Mark stepped forward, a silent protector, as though his very presence would shield me from whatever this man had in mind. Audrey's son is not yours to claim, Mark said, his voice firm, unwavering. He has a father, and that father is here, with him, raising him. Blackwell's smile faltered for a moment, his expression darkening. And I suppose you're the perfect stand-in then? How noble of you. I flinched at his words, but Mark didn't waver. Don't talk to her like that, Mark said, his voice low but full of an intensity that made the room feel smaller. I'm not here to make a scene, but you don't get to just walk in and play father to someone you abandoned. For a long moment, Blackwell didn't respond. The room was suffocating in its stillness, and I could feel the weight of the years pressing on me. Years of betrayal, years of shame. But something was stirring inside me now. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was a quiet understanding, the kind that only comes when you realize the ghosts of your past will never leave you. But you can choose not to let them control you. You're right, Blackwell finally said, his tone almost thoughtful. I was never the father he needed, but I am his biological father, and I have a right to know him. He has a right to know me. I felt a flicker of something deep inside. A sadness, perhaps, or even pity. For all his wealth, all his power, Mr. Blackwell had never truly understood what it meant to love someone, to sacrifice for them, to protect them. I glanced at Mark. He gave me a small nod, his hand still holding mine, a steady anchor in the storm. You're right, I said softly, is a cruel illusion, a right you forfeited the moment you walked away. My voice trembled but steadied as I continued. My son has a family now. He doesn't need you. Not now. Not ever. Blackwell's face darkened, his jaw clenched. You think you can erase me, Audrey? You think you can pretend I'm nothing? His eyes bored into mine with an intensity that felt almost suffocating. You may have your life now, your little family, but you can't escape me. I will always be a part of you. I swallowed hard, but Mark squeezed my hand, his strength grounding me. Audrey doesn't need your legacy, he said, his voice unwavering. She's building something of her own, and our son is part of that. The words were simple, but they hit their mark. For the first time, I saw Blackwell falter. There was no response, no retort, only the silence that hung in the air like a weighty truth. I could feel the years of resentment and pain start to release their hold on me. It wasn't a single moment that healed the wounds, but perhaps this one small piece of it, standing here, not as the scared girl who had been manipulated, but as a woman who had fought for her son, her family, her own life. Go home, I said quietly, my voice firm. You've already taken enough from me. Now leave us in peace. For a long while, Blackwell didn't speak. He only stared at me, as if measuring the distance between us. The silence stretched on, and for the first time I didn't care what he thought of me. The power he once held over me had dissipated into nothingness, just like the cold shadows of the evening sun that began to creep across the room. Finally, Blackwell stood, slowly, as though the effort was too much. I'll never forget you, Audrey, he said, his voice harsh and resigned. You won't have to, I replied, turning to leave, because I'll never forget you either. The drive home was quiet, but it wasn't the suffocating silence of before. It was something else, something lighter. I could feel the weight lifting off me with every mile we put between ourselves and Blackwell Manor. Mark didn't ask me anything. He didn't need to. When we finally arrived home, I saw my son playing in the front yard, his laughter ringing through the air. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over everything. And in that moment, I realized how far I had come. My son didn't need a legacy. He didn't need power or wealth. He needed love. He needed a family, and that was something no man, no matter how powerful, could take from us. As I watched him, my heart swelled with a quiet contentment. We were a family, our family, and no one could ever change that.